In the previous lecture, we created a radio button and changed its visual characteristics. Also, we learned about the setOnCheckChange method. In this lecture, we will further explore radio buttons. In fact, we want to create a list and put a number of radio buttons inside it. Then we will define a functionality for each of them. First, I stopped the emulator for the last lecture and I closed the main activity class. Then I opened the activity main layout. In order to create a list of radio buttons, we must first define a radio group inside our layout. So I type inside the layout Android.Widget.RadioGroup. Our radio group requires a height and a width. In the preview section, I set its height and width to wrap content. After height and width, I'm going to define an ID for it. @+ID / RadioGroup_ID. And I close my radio group completely. Once we defined our radio group, we must place all our radio buttons inside the group. So I cut this line of code and I paste it here so that my AppCompatRadioButton will be part of my radio group. So far, our radio group has a single AppCompatRadioButton. I want to add another AppCompatRadioButton to my radio group. So I copy this radio button and I paste it down below. Next, I change its ID to RadioButton2_ID and its text to RadioButton2. I press Alt and Return, extract string resource, and OK. So what we did was to create a radio group and place two AppCompatRadio buttons inside the radio group. Okay. We are done with our activity main layout. I close this layout and I open the main activity class. I remove this part of code that is for the AppCompatRadioButton. Then inside the main activity class, I create an object from the radio group class. I name my object radio group with a small r and semicolon. Inside the onCreate method, I get the reference for my object. I type radio group equals, I cast the right side to radio group, and then I type find view by ID r.id dot RadioGroup_ID. And semicolon. Then I type RadioGroup dot and I call the method setOnCheckChangeListener. Inside the parentheses, I type new onCheckChangeListener. As you can see, the onCheckChange method was added to our class. When we select each one of the radio buttons inside our radio group, the code inside this method will be executed. But the difference between this method and the one we used for switches is that we don't have a Boolean variable anymore as input parameter. Instead, we have an integer parameter named I. When we select each of the radio buttons, its ID will be stored in this I variable. So I use a switch statement here. Inside the parentheses, I enter the variable I. Now I use a case statement. I type r.id.radiobutton1 underscore id colon and then I type break and semicolon. And the next case is case r.id.radiobutton2 underscore id and then break. So what we did was that we created a switch statement and inside the parentheses we entered the I parameter. Then inside the switch we used two case statements, one for each radio button. So when we select each of the radio buttons, the code inside the onCheckChange method will be executed. And if the value of I was equal to the ID of radio button 1, then the code inside our first case will be executed. Otherwise, if the ID stored in I was equal to the ID of radio button 2, this means that the user has selected the second radio button. So the code inside the second case will be executed. You can enter your desired code under these case statements. Now I use a toast. Toast.makeText. Inside the parentheses, I enter getApplicationContext. For its text, I enter radio button 1. And for its length, I enter length long. Then I call .show. I copy this toast and I paste it for the second case as well. But I change its text. Now if I run my project on the emulator, when I select my first radio button, the code for my first case must be executed, and the toast message radio button 1 must be displayed. On the other hand, if I select my second radio button, then the code for my second case must be executed, and therefore the toast message radio button 2 must be displayed. Okay, let's run the app. Alright, our application was launched on the emulator. Here we have two radio buttons on our layout which are placed inside a radio group. I'm going to select my first radio button, and we see that the toast message radio button 1 was displayed. As we expected, the unchecked change method was executed, and the toast statement for our first case worked correctly. Now I select the second radio button, and the toast message radio button 2 is displayed. This time the code inside our second case was executed. So you can enter your customized code under these case statements. I select my first radio button and then the second radio button. We see that as I select each of these radio buttons, a toast message is displayed accordingly. Note that when you use radio buttons inside a radio group, the user can select only one radio button at a time. And that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will get output from our radio button project. So follow the tutorials in the next lecture.